Hi, everyone. We have an awesome live today. We have Kathleen Draper. This is going to be so awesome. We're all going to learn so much. We have people from all over the world that's going to be watching this today. Super, super excited.
Yeah, I can't wait. We were talking a little bit backstage. It's going to be a really great interview, guys. You're going to love this. She's super friendly, outgoing. It's going to be great, and it's going to provide you with a ton of information about biochar. So, yay! I'm so excited.
So, welcome everybody. Welcome everybody in. Now, who is Kathleen Draper? Well, in addition to serving as the USBI board member, Kathleen Draper has been a board chair for the International Biochar Initiative and has been in the biochar industry for more than a decade. She has written and spoken about biochar to audience around the whole globe. Boom! Mrs. Draper has co-authorized 2 books about biochar. Urban Fire to Cool the Earth and Terra Preta, and how the world's most fertile soil can help reverse climate change and reduce world hunger. Boom.
Boom. And the book is I want to know what biochar is. I don't know anything about it. Well, you're going to learn tonight, honey.
This is going to be awesome. Kathleen is also the U.S. director for the Ithaca Institute for Carbon Intelligence, a nonprofit open source organization focused on the use of biochar and climate farming, agroforestry, as well as the industrial uses of biochar. Mrs. Draper is also the co-founder of Sea Interest, a materials company working to commercialize biochar-based composites. She has a master's degree in managing for sustainability. Prior to becoming involved with the biochar world, she worked for an international consultant firm, working on various internal and external areas, including project and knowledge management, human resources, and so much more. So this is going to be totally awesome. So I'm going to show you guys our 6 inches of soil video that we always promote, and we're going to get going to this live. So you guys are really going to enjoy today. I hope you guys share this out. We are super, super excited because we're all going to learn. 6 inches of soil.
6 inches of soil feeds 8 billion people.
We already grow enough of all the human essential nutrients to feed everyone who's alive.
Farming is the single biggest cause of biodiversity collapse, the second biggest cause of climate change.
Soil is the most valuable resource on the planet, and we're degrading it without even realizing.
We have come to believe that money is more important than soil. That idea has to change.
Regenerative agriculture is farming that we're producing food, but also farming in harmony with nature.
You're working with nature, not against it.
The more people see it, the more that they realise that it works.
Having a regenerative agroecological system, that is surely the solution.
Soils are absolutely phenomenal in the amount of carbon they can store.
What we absolutely need now is urgent action from the government.
Until you deal with 9 retailers who have 94.5% of food sales in Britain, you're not going to have a level playing field.
Consumers have a choice. They can decide to buy cheap meat from industrial farms, or they can find farmers that really value animal welfare and the environment that we're farming in.
Dad started regen farming for the future generations to come, and that was the most selfless act he could have done.
The people who are doing this are making big sacrifices.
I think the potential is absolutely huge here.
These farms really can change the world.
It's all about the soil, isn't it, really?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
6 inches of soil coming right around the corner.
I can't wait to see it.
Oh, I can't wait to see it. That's going to be so awesome. And you know what? There's so many movies coming out that are getting out there about the soil. We got to keep on pushing and pushing and pushing it because the world's at its, we're in our last inch of soil. So we got to build it up. Hey, Tony, welcome in. So Anyway, guys, we got Kathleen Draper, and this is a special live. So I hope you guys really enjoy it. So welcome in, Kathleen.
Hello.
So how did you get into biochar?
So I went back to do a master's degree kind of late in life in managing for sustainability. And I was reading, trying to figure out where's my place in this. And the only one I really understood, because I grew up on a farm, was this thing called biochar. And I ended up doing my thesis on it. And then I said, I'm going to just dive into this industry, not really realizing how early stages it was. But nevertheless, I am very happy that I did so. It's a fascinating industry. And now, finally, after 12 years that I've been in it, it is really starting to scale in ways that I never anticipated. So, yeah.
Now, saying you grew up on a farm, what kind of farm did you grow up? Did you get, like, was it a 50-acre farm, a little half acre? How big of a farm did you live on?
I think it's about 500 acres now. It was just under 4 when we first moved here when I was a kid. My dad was actually an orthodontist, but he wanted his 5 girls to be raised in the country. And so we were out there. It's a beef farm for the most part, but we had corn and hay and all that stuff. So we were out there on tractors and feeding cows from a very young age.
And so what is your earliest memory on a farm?
Oh, well, I wasn't born on the farm, but it was feeding cows. We had been suburbanites until I was about 11 years old. So it was a big culture shock, but I'm eternally grateful for having grown up for the formative years in a rural environment on a farm to really understand where our food comes from and how hard farmers work and what the risks they take are every day. And yeah, everyone I went to school with in high school was in farming. So
I can just imagine what that feels like to be on a bigger scale, because I'm not on a bigger scale, but every time I start my starts and I get them ready to go outside, I get heart palpitations because it worries me. Like anything could just come and destroy these, hail, hard water, whatever. And I can't imagine planting, 500,000 seeds and worrying about them. So I can just imagine what it's like to be a big time farmer. So
yeah, and it's still small compared to some of the farms I've seen out west, but for upstate New York, it's a good sized farm.
Awesome.
Now, for everybody in the chat, we're going to try to answer questions later on, but you have to be on topic. So if we're asking a question that's on topic, and if we see a question, we have no problem putting it in there. But if it's off topic, then we just can't bounce around. So just to let you guys know. So just to start off, for the people that have no idea what biochar is, what is biochar?
So I explain biochar in a couple of different ways. And I always say that I explain it to my mother as burnt toast. So imagine taking toast, or really any kind of organic material, putting it in your oven, closing the door to limit the oxygen, and cranking up the temperature. If you leave it in too long or you have it up too high, it becomes burnt toast. Well, that's pretty unappetizing to you and me and most humans that I know, but it's also actually unappetizing to soil microbes. So when you put this black charred material in the soil, it doesn't decompose like most other organic material will in 6 months to a couple of years. So it is a very stable form of carbon when you use it in soils or in other applications. Nowadays, people are talking about it for water filtration. So we refer to it as biochar when it's being used to basically disrupt the carbon cycle. If you're using it for fuel or something, then we call it charcoal. But biochar is specifically when you're taking that carbon from plant resources and converting it from the short-term carbon cycle to the longer-term carbon cycle.
Now, it was my understanding that biochar is hardwoods. Is that correct? Like maples and oaks?
It can be anything.
Okay, so I could burn pine. It would be okay.
You could burn corn stalks. You can burn rice husks. You can burn manure. Yeah. So anything that's organic, you can pyrolyze, which is this oxygen limited thermochemical conversion that we use to carbonize material. You can carbonize almost anything, including plastics and tires. Now, that does not count as a viable feedstock for biochar, but as long as it's organic in nature, then it is considered a positive list or an okay.
That makes me feel so much better, because this whole time I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I have to make this, but I thought I only had to use like hard woods and stuff. And I'm like, where am I going to get the oak to do this, or the maple wood to do this? So like, I have tons of pine here, but I was told not to use pine. So I'm glad you clarified that, because I might be making my own biochar now.
Pine is actually one of the most common ones in the U.S. because of all that pine beetle kill. It's a great resource for making biochar. But I will just say up front that every feedstock and even the temperature at which you turn it into biochar makes for different properties. So depending on what you're trying to do with the biochar, whether it's hold on to nutrients or improve water holding capacity, they will be slightly different. Now, soils don't necessarily need a specific kind. It could be a blend of different types of feedstocks. But if you are a greenhouse grower and this is the one plant that you're growing, you're going to be pretty specific on what the properties of biochar are that are important to you.
That's great.
So to lead right into that, explain to everybody what terra preta is.
So terra preta, which means dark earths in Portuguese, was one of the indigenous cultures, this being in the Amazon, that created these anthropogenic soils that were highly fertile. So the Amazon is not really known for being fertile, believe it or not, even though, they have the rainforest, most of the fertility is above ground. So they really had poor growing soils. But in the Amazon, they created these soils, which I believe was really a sort of cooking / waste management process that may have been coincidental, but ended up being the way that they increased the soil fertility. So I've been down to Peru and I've seen their cooking style. They call it pachamanca. They dig holes into the earth and they put dry matter, and then they put fresh trees across the cooking pit and stones on top. And they get this all hot. The idea here is to get the stones hot. Then they put the stones below and they cook their vegetables and meat on top of the stones. And then what I think happened is they probably collected human urine and whatnot in pottery. And then to quench the fires, they dumped this on the fire, because what we've seen in the archaeological record is there's a lot of pottery shards, there's a lot of nutrients, and there's this charcoal. So observing them doing this cooking thing, I'm like, I bet that's how they did it. Now, here in North America, I attended, this is probably 12 years ago, near me, an indigenous museum where they were showing how they think the North American Indians created these dark earth soils. And it was completely the opposite. They believe they created these teepee-like substances of wood, then packed it with mud around it and put holes around the bottom, and they lit the fire from the top. And they would let this burn and smolder for a day or two. And that is where they planted the Three Sisters. And so this local museum near me did this test several years ago. And they planted the, corn, beans, and squash. And that year they happened to have terrible hail. And the only places where it survived was on these elevated terra preta soils. So I think it happened concurrently in different ways, but that's what I can tell you about.
They basically created their own kiln, like right then and there, with clay and what they had to make it from. That's really cool. Now I got a question about the rainforest. Now, when you see like the slash and burn method that they use down there, now, is that considered something that's going to help the soil down there because of the lack of nutrition? It's not. Okay.
It's a very short-term help. So it'll create a lot of ash, maybe a little carbon, but those soils are quickly exhausted, which is why they keep burning more and more and more.
That's horrible because there's so much plant life down there that we could be using for medicinal purposes and all different kinds of things, but they're wiping it out. That's horrible.
Tragic. Yep.
Now, how about if you have your biochar, right, and you're adding compost and all this stuff? Does the microbes stay? How long does the microbes stay around the biochar?
I think there's no limit to how long they like the biochar. A lot of people describe it as being a housing for very tiny organisms. And the compost industry is probably still one of the largest buyers for biochar right now. And they like it for a number of reasons. The U.S. Composting Council has done research into biochar. One of the reasons was because a lot of the horse manure that they get had herbicides and pesticides that persisted through the animal, was sprayed onto the hay and whatnot before harvest, and then it persisted and it was damaging the crops that the compost was being used on. So they were looking for a way to alleviate that problem, and they tested biochar, and what they found is that it helped to immobilize those toxins. The other reasons that they like it is that it tends to get the pile hotter, so it will burn off more pesticides. Okay. It holds nutrients longer, and it adds a more stable, long-lasting carbon to.
Wow, that's awesome. So that biochar can really help people and stuff like that, because I've heard so many tragedies of people, they put straw or horse manure on their beds, and because of herbicides and stuff like that, because the horses don't process that, it goes right through them, and you put that directly on your bed, and it can ruin your beds, and that's horrible. So that's cool about the biochar, and that's really cool that it warms it up enough to just gets rid of it, so you don't have to really do anything to it. And that's that makes life simple for people that like to garden. And just in general, that's really awesome. So
the other thing, it tends to be biochar an insulator, a soil insulator, so it can moderate the change in the temperature of the soil.
Oh, cool.
Which is great where I live in the north, and I would love my soil to warm up a little quicker in the springtime.
Yeah, now I'm curious because I dumped a bunch of biochar. I'm going to go out there and take my soil's temperature and see what it's like, because I have a bunch of carrots in there now, and they're thriving even when it snowed. So I'm curious now.
Interesting.
How you struck my interest on that.
So for sustainability, there it is. It's out. How does that contribute with biochar?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways. The main thing that people get excited about is, as I said, it tends to take renewable carbon in the form of plants or manure out of the short-term carbon cycle. It slows down the process of the carbon going into carbon dioxide. So it is a recognized form of carbon sequestration. So removal, and removals are like the sexy new thing, according to the International Panel on Climate Change. Reducing fossil fuel use is great, but we now have to figure out ways to substantially remove carbon from the atmosphere. So biochar can do that, and it can last depending on what the temperatures are that you cooked it in. The higher the temperature, the more durable the carbon, but also the lower the yield. So that's one big part of it. The other thing it can do, especially with things like compost, is reduce methane emissions, which is a big deal. So we've seen reports, although again it's variable, that if you put biochar in dairy cow manure, it can reduce methane emissions by 85%.
Wow.
The other thing it can do is reduce the need for chemical fertilizer. Not 100% probably, but you don't need as much because it's going to hold on to it. As you know, after you put on nitrogen and it rains, you lose a whole lot of it. If you're blending the biochar with chemical fertilizer, you don't need nearly as much. So that's another way it's going to reduce emissions related to fertilizer production and soil
So
emissions.
if I put this biochar, I have like 50 chickens. I have a ton of birds. I have turkeys and ducks and everything. So if I put this biochar on, like, when we empty out their place and put it in the compost, if I put that on my biochar, would that reduce, like, I don't know how to explain this. Would that reduce the heat in it so I could put it on my beds faster? Because typically you have to wait like a year before you can put that on your beds. Would the biochar like cut that down by half, or?
Is that because of a temperature thing you're saying?
Yeah, usually the manure is hot, so you can't put it on your beds right away.
I can't answer that definitively, but I can tell you it'll reduce the odor significantly quickly. Also, a lot of people are feeding certain good, high quality biochars to animals. So if you put it through the animal, you could probably use it a lot quicker than a year.
That is so cool that you said that, because I could totally put that in a little bit in their feed, and that would be amazing. Then when they, go to the bathroom in the coop or whatever, I can put that directly into my compost, and that is amazing. I had no idea you could do that. Can humans eat biochar?
Oh, yeah, they do. It's historically been what you get at a hospital if you've ingested toxins, is they'll give you activated carbon to pull those out.
So it's basically like charcoal, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay, because I know they use that for like anthrax and stuff like that. They give you charcoal pills to get rid of it and stuff.
But you have to be very careful. I mean, you don't want to be producing your own. You want to be producing it from a very consistent, high temperature process.
Right.
But in Europe, that was one of the biggest markets for biochar, is feeding it to livestock. Here in the US, unfortunately, the FDA took it off their approved list. And the official story is that was because a farmer was using biochar to mask bad feed. It had certain toxins, and so the biochar was neutralizing that. But those of us in the industry think there's, other powers that be that don't want it to displace pharmaceuticals.
I was reading up a little bit about biochar. I mean, I'm still new to all this biochar stuff because I just did it like last year for the first time. But I am amazed with how it works. I heard online that it can increase our carbon footprint. Is that true? Or is that just people just yapping because they don't like biochar?
It's the opposite. I mean, it can decrease. I mean, that's what the whole carbon sequestration is. That said, there's a lot of people making biochar in the old ways, like they made charcoal, and those can be polluting. So, I mean, I'm not going to say blanket, it's always sequestering carbon. A lot of it depends on, are you using the heat produced, the excess heat produced in an efficient way? Are you quenching it in a way that doesn't create methane? But most industrially produced biochar sequesters carbon. It's carbon negative.
Do you have to activate biochar? That is a question I'm dying to ask you. Do you have to activate it? What is up with that? I put it in my bed. I put water on it because I water my plants anyway. But do you have to do that?
So that's an eternal debate within the biochar industry. And I've heard different things. So activate means a lot of different things. In the activated carbon world, that just means steaming it to sort of clear out the pores, increase surface area. In the agricultural world, it means blending it with something that has nutrients. So it could be chemical fertilizer, could be manure, could be compost, could be all sorts of things. Most research has shown that you don't want to just put raw biochar in. But the other side of that coin is it depends, which is the most common refrain you'll hear about biochar. If you're putting it in the fall and the plants don't really need the nutrients, it will have time to acclimate. And so in certain situations, like here in New York, where they hill up the vineyards, it might be fine to put the biochar in. It's not going to starve the vines of nutrients for 6 months. The vines are going to sleep. I also heard from a hemp farmer that there are certain periods during the growing season where they want to starve the plant of nitrogen.
Yeah.
So In general, I would say yes, that's true, but there are situations where it doesn't matter.
Okay, that's cool.
So I have a question for you. When choosing material for biochar, how do you know which properties that biochar will provide without extensive testing?
Oh, you'd have to know your way around biochar. Even most producers, I would say right now, they're in biochar production for different reasons. It's either waste management, which you'll often see where, there's just so much biomass that needs a home, whether it's sewage sludge or trees or whatever. They don't know a lot about biochar or agriculture. And that's a bit tricky and dangerous. So I would say talk to an agronomist who knows about biochar. Don't assume.
Okay. Is biochar different from charcoal?
Generally, charcoal is made at much lower temperatures. They have this process called torrefaction, and the main thing they're trying to do there is dewater the biomass. So you could be cooking at like anything around 300 degrees Celsius. Biochar tends to be cooked between 400 and 800 degrees Celsius. So you cook off more than just water. You cook off a lot of volatiles. You get a much lower yield, but you get a much higher what they call hydrogen to carbon ratio. And that's what determines the longevity, the durability, the permanence of the biochar.
And going back, because I forgot to talk about it. You have 2 books. Can you tell everybody about your 2 books and where we could buy them?
I think they're still both on Amazon. The first one, I was actually asked, there was a book called Terra Preta, written by a German woman several years before I got involved. And then there was funding to translate it into English. And I think what happened is whoever they hired to translate it didn't know a whole lot about biochar and very little about agriculture. So they asked me to come in and I said, well, I'm happy to help, but it really needs to be updated and globalized. So whereas it had a very German focus, my role was to bring in different elements of what was happening with Terra Preta or biochar globally. So that's several years old now. I can't even remember. I want to say it was 2016 or 17. And it's very much focused on its soil uses. The second book I wrote with Albert Bates, it was called Burn, Using Fire to Cool the Earth, was much more focused on non-agricultural uses of biochar. So, using it in building materials like concrete, asphalt, things like that. And what was interesting about that is Albert and I were basically just reading the tea leaves of the scientific literature to see, all right, where's this going to go beyond agriculture? Because we'd been at the ag market for more than a decade. And it's a tough nut to crack because biochars are very different, soils are very different, crops are very different, weather. So it's sort of hard to give a straight answer because, as I said, it depends. What are your growing constraints? What can biochar do to help alleviate them? But with non-ag uses, it's a little more straightforward. So we wrote a book about that, which was a lot of fun.
Now, have you guys thought about doing like plastic disc or biochar disc that you could put around trees?
Funnily enough, I usually work every year with different teams at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And this year we're working on a project to do injection molding for permeable pavements, to see both if you can use it in the grid-like system itself, but also if you use biochar as part of the infill, what does that do to how quickly it can absorb water. But there's another group at RIT that's been doing some really interesting research on putting biochar in agricultural mulch, which is a lot trickier than it sounds. So yes, there's a lot of different initiatives. None are really commercial yet, but there's a lot in the research phase that I think we'll start to see more and more of. But as I mentioned before the show, I've put it in my drip line below my roof line to absorb more water. I put it in my septic system. I put it in my drain lines where the water pipes go. So there's a lot of different ways it can be used around the house. I also have it in the plaster in one of my walls. This is a straw bale house that I built a few years ago, and I've used it in my epoxy floors and countertops in my bathrooms and my grout. So yeah,
That's
I was
so
trying to get
cool.
creative.
Yeah, I love it. So awesome.
So if you plot it once, how long does it last? And do you have to apply it after a certain period amount of time, just like you would do with compost?
So the durability again gets back to how hot was the temperature. If you're cooking it at 400, it probably still has 100-year lifespan. If you're cooking it at 700, it probably has 1,000+ years. I mean, the terra preta soils that they dug up are from thousands of years ago. And not only are they still there, but they think it has this priming effect that it promotes additional carbon building and stability in soils beyond just the biochar. So it's hard to give an exact answer. Some of that, they say, is dependent on soil temperatures. Some of it, if you've top dressed it, which isn't what I would recommend necessarily, but and it rains, if you're on a slope, it's going, but it's not going to decompose. It's probably just going to the local water body and going to sink, you know. How often do you want to do it? Again, you know, in the early days, the trials were saying 20 tons per acre, which is a bit of a shock to the system, right? So I think it's a bit better to do microdosing over a 5-year period. It's a lot more affordable. You can see if it's helping or not helping. And again, if you have highly fertile soils, my brother-in-law was heading up an organic research farm, and he said, "Oh, these people are telling me about biochar," and we tried it, and it didn't have any impact. And I was like, "Well, you have fabulous soils. What was the purpose in using biochar?" So really, you have to think about what are you trying to solve, and also what are the economics of it? Because right now, some biochars are quite inexpensive, and I can say more about why later, but it's been pretty pricey. So putting it on, 1,000 acres of corn doesn't make sense. But putting it on grapevines or high value vegetable fields that have water deficient soils, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Also, the NRCS has just come out in the last couple of years with this code 336. So farmers are being paid to add soil carbon, and biochar is one way you can do that. So is compost. So there's incentives now that can help.
I'm totally putting this in my food forest.
Now, how about with like a pH factor? Is it neutral, or is there?
No. Definitely not neutral. And again, this is temperature dependent. The higher the temperature, the higher the pH. But most biochars are alkaline. And again, it kind of depends if you've cleaned out some of the ash. So some of the low-tech ways of making biochar, you can do that, but not all. So it does have a liming effect, but it's pretty temporary.
So when this is going to be probably an odd question. So say, for instance, I want to filter my water. Is that process called osmosis then? Because I'm using rocks, I'm using biochar as a filter for my water. I always loved, the reason why I ask is because I like water that has been filtered through osmosis. So.
Okay, I don't know if it's called osmosis, but I have done a bunch of different very low-tech filtration experiments with kids in my daughter's school, and it's very fun and easy to do. You just put food coloring in, and then you put a chunk of biochar in there, and the next day it's gone. What happens to it? It's sorbed into the pores of the biochar, but there are also other mechanisms at play, like electrochemical and all this stuff. So I can't exactly tell you what the mechanism is, because it could be more than one.
Okay.
So just going back to the pH. So if it's a standard, if it's not like a 500 degrees with it would be more neutral. Then the higher you go, it changes. That's what you're trying to say?
Yeah. It's rarely neutral. You would have to do something to make it neutral, like adding urine or something like that. but it tends towards alkaline. And I've seen it over 10, but that's at a very high temperature. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, why hasn't it been adapted to society earlier?
This is the perennial question. I think with any early, innovation, there's a struggle. One, it's expensive. Two, people don't know about it. So we're now at the point where it's not so expensive, but we're still at the point where 95% or more of the people I talk to have never heard of it. I think the other issue is it's so variable, and it's so versatile. So, this farmer who's got soils in Iowa that he grows corn on could have an experience with it that says, didn't do anything for me. Whereas this vegetable farmer in California that has, high priced whatever and high priced water, he's going to say, I love this. I would pay $2,000 per acre for this. So, you get mixed stories, and sometimes people think that sounds shady, but it's really, you have to ask very specific questions and really understand what biochar can or cannot do in certain scenarios.
Okay, well, how about watering? So I hear that you're using biochar. It stores the water right there for you. Is that true?
It is for most biochars. Yes, it's a sort of catch and release. So how much water holding capacity a particular biochar has differs depending on pore size distribution, surface area, and all that stuff. But yes, in general, that's a big reason why people are using it in California. People in the desert areas like it because it can moderate salinity in soils. People that are growing cacao in Peru, they like it because it can absorb some of the cadmium that's either naturally or not naturally in the soils. So people like it for all sorts of different reasons.
So if I had to make a compost tea with biochar, how do you do that?
Okay, I'm not the right one to ask that question. Sorry. I mean, I can tell you, people ask how much biochar do you put in compost, and that is anywhere from 10 to 25% biochar. And again, that comes down to economics. If you're making it yourself, put more in. If you're buying it, probably not going to want to do that until the price of it comes down to close to zero, because that's what they pay for a lot of their other compost materials.
Okay.
So we're so happy to have you on. How much do you
tell
travel?
You what I don't know, because I don't want to pretend I do know.
How much do you travel the world?
Oh, I just switched jobs actually in the last few weeks. So I'm working with a Swiss company called Carbon Standards International. And my territory is the Americas and Australia and New Zealand. So I probably will start traveling a little bit more. But some of the places I've gone to teach people about biochar are, and my favorite places are in Latin America. I've gone and taught coffee farmers how to make biochar using zero cost kilns or low cost as well, and showed them how to use it best in planting new coffee trees to minimize the cost of fertilizer, because the cost of fertilizer there is high. But I've taught it here in the Finger Lakes at a vineyard. I'm doing that again this year. So yeah, I travel a bit.
That's so cool. You don't actually live that far from me. I'm in Northeast Ohio, so
I'm in Western New York in the Finger Lakes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. What other questions? No, Joe, go ahead.
Oh, I got a lot of questions.
Did she blow your mind there for a minute?
No, I'm trying to give you a chance to talk.
Oh.
I feel like I'm hogging up the conversation. And thank you, Jane, for posting about the book. I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you so much. I was actually looking for the link and I couldn't find it. So thank you so much for doing that.
Now we're talking about other countries. How far, who's more advanced and who has no idea what's going on in the biochar world?
That's a good question. So, and I'll answer it a couple of different ways. I wish the US was at the forefront. I don't really consider that we are yet, but we just last week had our Biochar conference and we had over 600 people coming, which is probably 50% more than a few years ago. So it is scaling. But I would say that the most sophisticated buyers are probably in Scandinavia. They use a lot of biochar for urban tree planting, which again is high value application, which is good in the early stages of developing an industry. And they originally did this because they knew that it was extending the life of the trees. So it was kind of costly to replace trees. But then what they observed is that the way they had this structured soil with biochar and gravel was helping with the infiltration and filtration of the stormwater that was coming in. And they are right by the sea. So anything they can do to do that was very helpful. So now they've deployed pyrolysis and biochar production all over Sweden. And same thing in Norway and Finland and Denmark. I think they're probably some of the most impressive areas. The US, we're coming along. They just did a survey of the global biochar industry, and the US supposedly has between 1 and 200 producers. Now, that could be everything from backyard producers, which I might be considered one of those, to I think probably the biggest. Well, some people claim to be making 25,000 tons a year. And I think a lot of that is actually being sold as charcoal versus biochar, because the market, the demand for the biochar itself is kind of hit or miss. It's good out in the West, but less strong here in the East Coast. And then we hear about China, where I've been over there 3 times in the last 6 or 8 years. And they have enormous pyrolysis machines over there. And they're really trying to wean farmers off of in situ residue burning, and because that's just creating huge air pollution. And so they're trying to create these centralized pyrolysis units that will not only make that into biochar, but combine it with fertilizer and then giving that back or selling that back to the farmers as an additional way to reduce carbon.
This might sound like a weird question, but when you're buying something from China, like food wise, how organic, like especially if it's organic, how organic is it?
Oh, I have no idea. But I will say that I would worry more about the heavy metal content in the produce you're buying, because what I've heard, and one of the main reasons they've been interested in biochar research, is that a lot of their soils, and I don't know if it's 10% or more of the soils used to grow food, are toxic because of poor waste management in the past. So.
Yeah. So you think biochar or something like that would soak that up?
It does immobilize it in many cases.
That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I wondered about that, because I know they don't have regulations like we do here. So I was curious, and I'm sorry, I might not even ask the right question as far as that was concerned, but I was curious.
It's not just China. It's a lot of the developing world where they just don't have the regulations, or the regulations aren't enforced. So this thing I mentioned about Peru is the only reason it was coming up is the EU said, all right, this is the limit for cadmium in chocolate. And they were not passing because they have so much cadmium in soils. It's the same thing with lead in other areas. So we were starting to see with this regulation that farmers are caught in a bind. You know, they either have to stop selling to Europe, find other markets, or find other products that aren't regulated. So what a colleague of mine found in Peru is that you can use biochar on existing cacao trees, put it around the drip line, under some mulch or whatnot, and it will absorb the toxins. So reducing the levels so that they could meet the EU regulations, which is awesome. We have the same thing here with organic orchards where they used copper forever. That's not great for the human system. So
no,
immobilize that makes those kind of farms useful again. Same thing with PFAS that we're finding in a lot of farms that took sewage sludge untreated for years. Those farms are now toxic. Nobody wants to buy from them. Well, as long as you're testing for it, which we haven't been doing very consistently.
Yeah.
But now that we're finding it out, farmers are like, what do I do? So
that's interesting. And right now you're hearing a lot of things in Europe and stuff about farmers protesting and stuff like that. And I assume it's because of the strict regulations that these countries are putting on farmers, kind of restricting what they can use and whatnot. So I assume that biochar could help these people out tremendously.
It's heavily regulated over there. I think only in the last year have they gotten EU regulation allowing it to be sold to farmers. Yeah.
And it's weird that we're the lead in something like this. Isn't that weird?
Yeah, there's a lot of jealousy over that NRCS code 336.
Like, usually Europe comes up with something like that, and then we'll just kind of trickle along behind. But to be a lead in something like that just kind of...
Interestingly, I think one we have this IRA funding. Two, it's surprisingly an apolitical topic, which is rare these days. So we have a lot of Republican support for biochar, and I think that has sort of its roots in farmers want some solutions to problems, but also it's a biomass handling thing, which is not really a political question.
Yeah, we just had glyphosate girl on here, and she talked about glyphosate and Roundup and all that stuff. So we can use biochar to soak some of this up. We can totally redo the way we're farming, and even it's in our drinking water. It's in everything. So if we could, biochar might be the solution to a lot of things out there, and we just need to use it more.
Yeah, I do think you have to be careful with those sort of things because a lot of people are still going to use glyphosate. And if you use biochar right after or even before, it can neutralize it to some extent, meaning you just have to use more to get the same effect. So I think it's important to be aware that if you're going to be using those herbicides, pesticides, insecticides, biochar can help later on. If you want to sorb them, it can certainly help grab it out of wastewater and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So many uses for it that,
Well, and again, it's not every biochar that can do everything. And I think this is where we get into a little bit of trouble in the industry where everybody thinks, oh, I bought biochar, it can do 100 different things. Well, likely not.
Yeah.
So yeah, it all looks the same, unfortunately, or fortunately, but it's quite different biologically, chemically, all sorts of, physical properties are different. So
I'm sorry, we have a question. Go ahead.
So Billy has a question down below. Do you see it?
Yeah.
So heavy metals are basically immobilized, which is not the case with nutrients. That's more of a catch and release situation. So most people that are doing heavy metal remediation are leaving it in situ. And I'll give you an example. I've been doing biochar webinars for the International Biochar Initiative for years. And the last one I did was a woman who's remediating hydraulic gold mine lands. And they're top dressing it. The issue there is nothing can grow because of all the arsenic still there. And so they have huge problems, not only with nothing growing, that causes erosion, which causes downstream issues in the water treatment areas. So she has been testing, just kind of imagine raised beds with biochar, one with nothing and one with biochar and compost. And then looking at the water from the runoff after rain or fake rain in this case. And she found that it was able to immobilize this arsenic quite well. And the next step of that is to get stuff to grow so that you don't have this constant erosion of soils. So so yes, it can be useful in mineland reclamation. I'm on a advisory team that's looking at using it in capping abandoned oil wells, both in the concrete pad at the bottom, but also in the fill and then around the wellheads to immobilize some of those toxins. So yeah,
That's
a lot of
cool.
different options. Yeah.
That's really
Is there a thing called liquid biochar?
Yes, some people make it so small that they have a liquid application version. There's a group called RT in Iowa that does that sort of thing.
Does it work just as good? Have you used it?
I have not used it. You would have to ask them, but I'm a big fan of theirs. And the guy that owns that has a PhD in biochar, so he's very scientific about these things.
So, what is the response when biochar is in soil? What is the overall significance of it? Like, how much of an improvement? Like, I know it makes a better plant, a healthier plant, less insects, better control of the water. Everything is good. But what is even better? How is it even applied to a plant?
Yeah, again, it depends. The most common that I know of is combining it, say, with compost or manure and spreading it on a manure spreader. But if, say, you are planting new vineyards or orchards, you want to get it into the soil. And however you're adding your soil amendments is how you'll do it there. In gardening, it's definitely in the soil profile. That's a challenge. In Europe, I've seen it. They had these really interesting tillers that had pipes that had a liquid application down into the soil profile. So that's another way. But for the most part, I don't think we have the best equipment yet in the US for getting it into the soils. For large scale agriculture. For smaller scale, it's easy. And then, as I said, the most common one that I've seen or heard of is a manure spreader.
How exactly does this irritate bugs? How does it keep bugs out? I'm just curious. I know that it does. I've seen, but how does it work like that?
That's not a claim I hear a lot in the biochar world.
Okay.
So I'm kind of curious where that is coming from. It's probably similar to eggshells in that it's a very coarse material, so it might not like that. But what I do hear is that there is some evidence that came from a group out of the UK called Carbon Gold that it improves the immune system of the trees so that they can fight better, fight off certain pathogens or even the ash borer. I mean, beyond the technical side of it, the science, I'm not quite sure, other than it helps them to,
So it could help things along. So therefore it could repel bugs that way versus, because I know like plants, they set off certain things. So if like, for instance, if they're sick, then bugs are going to go directly to it because they know they set off that, I don't know,
pheromone or whatever.
Pheromone, yeah. Or like if say for instance, if you spray your tomato plants with aspirin or whatever, it helps them get better. It thickens, it makes them better so bugs don't attack them. It keeps them their, I don't know, immune system up. So biochar could probably do the same thing, and that's probably why it works better. Maybe. I don't know. My theory.
I think that's an agronomist question or soil scientist, which I am not.
Just curious.
Somebody just asked about what's the best wood. I don't think anybody would claim that there is a best wood. You can use hardwoods, softwoods. There are nuances even between like one hardwood to another, but they're quite, I would say, subtle. So unless you have a super specific use for biochar, for me, the answer is whatever you have available and then test it out to see if it's going to do what you want it to do.
That is really good to know because I really thought it had to be hardwoods. So I was worried. I have a wood burner in my house. So we do a lot of we burn a lot of pine or whatever we have available, really. Maple and oak is probably sometimes hard to come by. So we do have pine that we burn sometimes, even though it's not supposed to, you're not supposed to really burn it, but we do anyway. It heats our house, so that's how we do it, you know. So I was just curious about that. I was like, well, shoot. I'm like, how are we going to do that? But if you can use what you have, that makes it even better. And I think I'm going to start making it myself then, if that's the case.
Yeah, there's a lot of really low-tech ways to make it. Even if you have a wood-burning stove, what some people do is they'll create a little retort. So you can do this with just like an unused paint can that you poke holes in and put your biomass in there and toss it in the wood-burning stove. I have a friend of mine who he was a woodsman and he had an oversized wood-burning stove, and he would put it in kind of like a chafing dish kind of thing. So what you don't want is it to be super tight because then it will explode. But he would just actually, no, he did it even simpler. When it got red hot, he had a bowl of like a metal container with water next to the wood burning stove, and he would just shovel that red hot coals into the water.
Yeah.
And then he would take the chunks and put it in mesh to make the room less dry. So it was a way of humidifying it. And then he had an old coffee grinder that he would make it into smaller pieces. And he had the most beautiful daffodils, like 10,000 literally. And he would just top dress his gardens with it.
Nice.
Okay, I have to say we have two of my Biochar Academy alumni that have joined us, Sanjay and Kom from Thailand. So that's very nice of you guys to join us. Thank you. And so Sanjay, he's working a lot with smallholder farmers in India, and they use a low-tech, so does Komchalat from Thailand. They use what's called a flame cap kiln, which is kind of, imagine a cone-shaped kiln. And you can do this in the soil with no kiln at all, but it's easier to have a metal one. And you slowly build up your feedstock. And what's happening here is the flame cap is preventing oxygen from going down below that and turning it into ash. So you're actually creating biochar in a very efficient, low emission way. And then you quench it, and that clears out a lot of the ash. And that quench water will have a very high pH. And they can use that for cleaning or all sorts of things.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Now, how do we get biochar more to the mainstream? I mean, we have the whole initiative, but it's not down to like the home gardeners yet. It's nobody knows, even like you said before, nobody even knows about it.
Yeah.
How do we get it mainstream?
Well, you guys are helping. Thank you very much. I think it is about finding the right influencers that are willing to try it and tell their stories. Because, for me, going out over and over again, I have my little gardens and I've used it in different ways. I wrote a couple of books, but it's really about neighbors telling neighbors and farmers telling farmers, as opposed to it being top down. I think in many situations, we've seen that selecting the right farmers to do trials with is critical. You need somebody that's adventurous, that's willing to try new things, and that has respect of their community, and is willing to go out and tell their stories.
I think it's coming out actually a lot more, and I'm hearing about it a lot more, because literally 6 years ago, somebody asked me, where do I get biochar? Our friend Howie, Food Forest Permaculture, talks about it constantly. And we're like, where do we get this? And I'm like, I can't burn it. I can't make it myself. Like, where do I get this at? And I looked for it online on Amazon, and I couldn't find it anywhere. And now all of a sudden I'm finding bags of it. And I just feel like now it's starting to be a little bit everywhere. And I'm kind
I
of
hope
glad that it is. Yeah. Yeah.
And the fun part is that it's quite nice to make biochar with friends and family. It's not that hard to do if you're prepared. I said the fastest biochar I ever made, which was hectic, was I took my kiln over to a hemp farmer, and he had this dry, spindly biomass, and I'd never done it before. And oh my gosh, we were running to keep that piling on so it didn't turn to ash. But if you're doing branches or things like that, it's a lot more.
I thought you would laugh at that.
That's really cute.
Yeah, I think, you know, if you make it an event, which it can be in the right situation, it's fun.
Yeah, that's really neat.
Now, if I had to go to a store and find something, what's the what do you know? What not all biochar is good biochar. Not all good compost is good compost.
Mhm.
Is there any good recommendations?
So I would prefer a biochar that has gotten some kind of certification. In order to get that certification, it has to go through lab testing for pH and all that stuff. So, you know, I'm discerning, and I would say I want to see your labs if it's not on the label, so that you know the heavy metals have been tested, the PAHs have been tested, you know what it's made from, where it comes from. There, a while ago, I don't hear about this so much because U.S. production is going up. It would be coming in from China or wherever, and I just don't see that as necessary if you can get it from a local source. And we are, as you said, seeing more and more of it being produced. So that's great.
It still comes, you know what, people are starting to hear it, but they don't implement it. That's the big thing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And people think they make biochar, but are they really making biochar?
It's so confusing though. Like for me, like last year, like I didn't know what biochar was. Like I did get it, like I used it, but not like I do now. I don't, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of people out there that are like me and just like, okay, I'm gonna try this, but
keep telling that story.
Now breaking biochar. Do I leave it in clumps, or do I do like a little dance on it, break it in the bag, and there we go?
Yeah, this is a constant conversation in the biochar world, and I think you know, for your own gardening purposes, it doesn't really matter, especially in the north where the freeze frost cycle is going to micronize it over the years. But I also think having different sizes helps with compaction and things like that. But if you're trying to spread it through, you know, fertigation or whatever, you need a very small, consistent particle size. Does it matter for the soils? Again, it depends on what you're trying to solve. For compacted soils, I see no reason to use super small size biochar, but for sandy soils, it might make more sense.
Yeah. I'm just excited that I did use it on my cucumbers because it does hold water, and cucumbers definitely need extra water.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't even know that, and I was doing it. That's awesome.
Yeah. The other thing is, you know, non-ag uses, which I get very excited about. When I was building my house, it was all about carbon sequestration, not just with biochar, but, you know, it's straw bale house. It's got recycled wood and all that stuff. But I'd only known one other person that used it in plaster. So I really had to push the envelope, and putting it in my septic system. I swear to God, the civil engineer, when I first talked to him about this idea, thought I was a crazy woman. But he came back and did his research, and he goes, I figured out how we can do this without having issues with getting your septic system permitted. And, you know, then I wrote about it, I talked about it, and everybody's like, that makes sense. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of septic systems in Long Island that need to be replaced because they're leaching nutrients into the Long Island Sound. You know, why can't we use biochar? You know, we've got to have people that are willing to try it. unfortunately, I didn't have a civil engineer testing how good it is. But when I learned how these septic systems work, they're basically just scraping the soil, putting gravel, and then your pipe with holes underneath, then more gravel, then soil. So what you're doing is the effluent is going right into your subsoil. I know that biochar can help filter that. Why we're not doing that, and having it regulated is beyond me.
Here we have leach beds, right?
Well, this
Why
isn't my
aren't we
leach bed.
using biochar for leach beds?
This isn't my leach bed. Yeah, the drain fields. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it could really help water quality in many ways, but nobody's heard of it. So we need those pioneers that are willing to go out and just do it. Same thing around in dairy farms where they have the silage. When it rains, even if it's covered, a lot of those nutrients are going to leach out, and we should be having troughs of biochar around those silage pits. And every couple of years harvest the biochar, because guess what? It's going to have a lot of that leached nutrient in the biochar. Then you can take it out and put it on the fields and put some fresh biochar in there.
That is brilliant. Like, I love that. Yes, you could totally do that, and it'd be perfect for that situation.
Yeah.
So Serena had a question. Using a Mel's 1/3 mix, how much biochar should I put per cubic foot?
Don't start with that question. Start with, why do you want to use biochar? What are the growing constraints you're trying to alleviate? There is no one size fits all. Like I said, with my brother-in-law who headed up the organic farm, there's almost no reason to use biochar there. If you have good soils, it's too expensive. If you have bad soils and you have drought, then use a lot more. And check out what the economics are. What are you trying to achieve? If it's yield improvement, if you're a corn farmer in Iowa compared to a corn farmer in Africa, our yields are I don't know how many times larger, but you're never going to see the yield increase that they're going to see in Africa. So you have to refine the question to, what am I trying to achieve, and can biochar help with that? What about fish tank carbon? Yeah, that's activated carbon. You could probably use some certain types of biochar to do that same thing. But again, you got to test it. What I found, because I've done some activated carbon testing versus biochar testing, we were filtering effluent from a tofu company. And then what we did, we compared it with activated carbon and a couple of different commercially available biochars. And we found that it was good, probably not as efficient as activated carbon, but it was a lot cheaper. And then what we did is we were harvesting basically nutrients, not toxins in this case. But still, it was costing the tofu company money at the wastewater treatment plant because they had to pay more because it had these toxins in it. But then what we did is we gave it to Cornell to test the saturated biochar in tomatoes and I forget what it was, spinach and whatnot. And it was quite productive. So we compared it with unsaturated biochar and the saturated biochar, and there was a big increase in yields because of those nutrients.
Now, when you have your good guy bugs and a bad guy bugs, when you use biochar, what happens to the good guy? If it lessens the bad guys, does it lessen the good guys?
Yeah, again, I'm not claiming that it's lessening the bad guys. It's improving the immune system. What I've read is that it enhances the whole microbial community, which is probably what's enhancing the immunity. And probably what's mitigating the bad guys is having, housing for the good guys.
Yeah, because we talked about the pheromones, like how, like when your plant starts to die, or if there's something, a disease or something, and how all the bad bugs go to it. Well, biochar, if you put it in there, it's going to make the immune system of the plant better, so you don't get all those bad bugs going to it. You'll probably end up increasing your good bugs, maybe,
probably,
but your bad bugs aren't going to attack your plants as much because they're not going to be dying off from diseases and weird stuff, And even like if you don't put water on it because the biochar holds the water too. So your plant's not gonna wilt as much.
Yeah, it's not as sick or starved for water and nutrients. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to Billy's question, this is exactly the same thing. When you're harvesting the nitrogen, that's activating in a way the biochar. So I think it's a great idea. I've read some studies about putting it in aquaculture tanks and feeding it to the fish as well, and it does help with absorbing nitrogen. But in these aquaculture farms, they have a lot more than just nitrogen to worry about. They're feeding them antibiotics and all that stuff. So.
Gross stuff. Like they talk about, how the salmon and stuff, like how it's in those things and how it's not good to eat. Well, that's why they're swimming in their own feces and everything else. Yeah. It's disgusting. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
How can biochar aid in the degradation of organic pollutants?
How can it help in the degradation of organic pollutants? Yeah, that's a really sciencey question that I'm not sure I'm equipped, because there are different mechanisms. Very often it may not be degrading, but it may just be immobilizing. But I have read that it can degrade, certainly not heavy metals, but it could degrade like herbicides and pesticides. What the actual mechanism is, I have known in the past, but I can't quite remember. That's an agronomist and a soil scientist question.
I hope that we are explaining this enough for them out there, because I think if people understand a little more how it works, I think they'll be more prone to buying it. Okay, well, if this is helping the immune system of my plants, well, then, yeah, I'm going to buy some of this, And I hope that I'm explaining it. All of us are explaining it a little more for the people out there that didn't even know what biochar was until today.
And the other mechanism is simply that we have lost a lot of organic matter in our soils, and biochar is going to help add that back in. And we really need to add organic material. And it shouldn't just be biochar. It should be compost as well. But the thing with biochar is that it will last a lot longer.
Yeah.
Can biochar remove heavy metal pollutants?
It can immobilize them. Yeah. And again, this is where you have to know the biochar, because there's been a lot of research on this, but it's different biochars and their electromagnetic properties or different properties that work on, arsenic, metalloid versus lead versus cadmium. So yes, but this is where you really need a chemist and agronomist to tell you what your problem is and what kind of biochar properties are needed.
Does it change the acidity of the soil a little
bit?
Short term. Okay.
Although interestingly, one of the guys that's been in the biochar world the longest, he lives on Cape Cod, Bob Wells, fantastic guy, makes industrial scale biochar, and he has very sandy soils, obviously, high alkaline soils, and he uses biochar and in his blueberries, which need alkaline. And you would think adding an alkaline thing maybe isn't helpful, but he's had good results.
That's interesting, because I purposely have my blueberry plants underneath pine trees.
Yeah.
To get that acidity. So I wonder if I did a little biochar, if they would produce more.
Now, is there a place to get it tested if we want to get it? Oh, there is.
Yes. Again, you should be seeking biochar that's already been tested, but there's one lab that does it according to the IBI standards called Soil Control Labs out in California. They came from a compost testing background. And they do the basic soil chemistry properties, but then to have heavy metals and pHs they will send it out to labs that they work with. We're trying to get more labs. Frankly, there aren't enough. But the issue has been it's expensive to get the right equipment, and there hasn't been a high volume of demand for the testing services. But that's definitely starting to change.
Let me see. Does forest burning result in the production of biochar?
Yeah, this is such a good question. They say that the indigenous purposeful burning of the grasslands created a certain amount of the organic material that we see in the Midwest. Similarly, the indigenous cultures had this sort of forest burning method, and it does create a certain amount of charcoal biochar. Yeah. I'll tell you a little story. My brother-in-law lives in California, and he uses this open flame cap system called air burners that the U.S. Forest Service has been promoting for decades. And what they do is they go in before or after fires, frankly, but let's say after, where you have these dead trees, black on the outside, but it's only half an inch thick, but never going to grow again. And they go in and they cut those, and then they sort of make cookies out of them, and they put them in this air burner, and they can now make biochar out of that. And they are leaving it there. And then where the dead trees are, they have multiple sprouts, which does not help to reforest, but they're going in for the first couple of years and pruning so that there's one, strong shoot that then can help to reforest. And the biochar on the soil can also help. The issue with some of these fires is that it's so hot that, yes, it's making some biochar, but it's scarring the soils for decades.
Yeah.
So we don't necessarily want to promote that as a way of making biochar. But in these air burners, they're doing it, but in a concentrated section.
How about biochar in animal farming? And how's that initiated?
Yeah, I think this is a growth area. And if anybody wants to Google my name and dairy and biochar, I wrote a white paper on this a few years ago, but I think there's a lot of options here. And Cornell, which is about an hour and a half from me, they now have a small pyrolysis unit at a dairy farm in New York that is carbonizing part of the digestate, the fiber left over from anaerobic digestion. And then they're doing a couple of different things with it. One is to put it back into the digester, where they are finding that it can act as a buffer and actually help the quality and the quantity of methane being produced. And it does that, I think, by sorbing the hydrogen sulfide. So it holds onto that, making the methane of a higher quality, more of a pipeline quality biochar, which is great because then you don't have to do as much processing to get it in the pipeline. Again, it's not quite legal here, although I know people that do feed it to their animals. I was on a panel a couple of years ago with a dairy farmer in Ontario, Canada, and he said when he was trying it, the best thing he noticed, which I'd never read this in the literature, was that it was reducing abortions in his dairy cows. Now, that's a big deal because you don't want to have them out of production for very long. But,
no, I mean, how would that work? How does that work from that?
His hypothesis was related to this pulling out herbicides, pesticides, toxins in the feed to make the animal healthier. Wow. So I was part of a meta-analysis a few years ago on the topic of putting it in livestock feed. And I think the jury is still out on as to whether it can help reduce enteric methane. I think there's too many variables and it's really hard to quantify. So I don't know that I would push that. And frankly, until farmers are incentivized to reduce that, I don't think they're going to do much. But what I do like about it is it is a free delivery mechanism for cattle, chickens, whatever, that are free range to deliver that biochar across the field. Which is really helpful.
That's great. That's awesome. And okay, so I usually give some of my birds DE, food grade, little DE, little biochar. My birds are going to live forever. Let's keep them laying.
I know a lot of people in the biochar world that take it themselves, but I will just say, be careful because 2 reasons. One, if you take it on a daily basis, you may become constipated. And 2, if you're on medications and you take the biochar too close to when you've taken the medications, it can neutralize that. So I am cautious about that. And I think everybody should be.
Yeah, because basically it will strip your body like it does with everything else. It'll take all the toxins out of your body.
And the medicine. Yeah.
Yeah, including medicine. Yeah, that would not be good.
Now, how about biochar with manure?
It's a great combo for many reasons. This is where we do see science that validates that methane emissions are reduced. So I have a friend who just put in a grant to formalize that, figure out how to test it, and then write a methodology to incentivize farmers to use it, because otherwise they're not going to. Same with enteric and with manure management. They need some incentive to move away from what they are currently doing. But I will say with the Cornell project, one of the things that we were telling dairy farmers is that in New York State, I don't know if this applies elsewhere, but farmers have, let's say, 1,000 cows and the manure production is whatever it is. They need to have land that they own or a manure management system that can handle that for, let's say it's 6 months. I forget what the period is that they can't spread it on the fields during the wintertime because then it'll just go into the waterways. So it's quite expensive. Some of these are $1 million plus manure management systems. The nice thing about biochar and pyrolysis is that you have that manure reduced in volume by up to 95% in a matter of hours, as opposed to composting, which is months, anaerobic digestion is 30 days or so. And so if you have this big volume reduction, then that means the farmer doesn't have to go buy more land or increase their storage capacity when they want to increase the size of the herd. So
now this is a floating question. I think they asked it multiple times out there. Does biochar what about asthma?
Well, it is a dusty material. I would say you have to always be careful when you are spreading it. I would say it should be wetted down so that it isn't airborne. When you're making it, you have to, it's a craft. It's not something everybody does well the first time. But you have to know what you're doing. You have to test things out so you're not creating a lot of smoke. Mostly you can figure out how to do a smokeless burn if the material is dry enough and if you're feeding it in the right way. But the first time I went to Colombia to show them how to make biochar, I neglected to say it needs to be dry. And so they were giving me this really wet stuff, which is smoky and terrible. So we had to go find a dead tree on the farm and cut that up and start our fire that way. But yeah, you do have to be careful.
And by the way, guys, that's the same with DE. Do not inhale that. That is not good for you to inhale. So if you are using food grade DE, or even if you're using it in your plants, and if you do even have a slight trace of asthma, you definitely want to use a mask because you're definitely not supposed to breathe in DE at all. So just to let y'all know.
And how about the biochar in fish farming?
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of it happening commercially yet, but I have read scientific papers showing that, like with other kinds of livestock, it can help improve the health of the animals, the fish, and it can also help absorb some of that excess nitrogen in the tanks, which, as somebody mentioned previously, is actually enriching the biochar. And as long as you're not also absorbing antibiotics, could be used on land for other applications.
Yeah. Oh man, you got my mind just going. There's so many things I want to use this. I want to use in my food forest. I want to use in my beds this year. I'm just going to be powdery black.
That's the good and the bad part about biochar. There's so many rabbit holes to go down.
if you don't care, you don't wear gloves. But last year when I used it for the first time, my feet were black, my arms were black. I was like, my chest, like where I scratched myself or something, I had charcoal all over me. So just an FYI, guys, you're gonna get it all over you.
Yes. Well, I made soap with glycerin and biochar, so it's a good exfoliator, but I also have my toothpaste and my deodorant and my shampoo and whatnot. It became quite trendy. And what the cool thing about that is that it's very often displacing microplastics, which are horrible to think that that's in not only our beauty care products, but then in our water systems. And so I like the idea that I'm feeding my septic system with little bits of biochar from all these different things.
Yeah. My dad owned a septic service for like 50 years. And so I had no idea that you could use biochar. I mean, that's brilliant. Didn't even think about that. And so I wish my dad was still alive. I could tell him about it, but that's just like really fascinating. Like it could help. My neighbors need biochar because if you're like in the right area in my yard, you can smell their septic system.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy, right?
Yeah. And I'm like, man, maybe I should buy them a pack of biochar and just set it on their porch. But yeah.
Well, my civil engineer, the way we ended up doing it, because it had to get permitted and it's not in any regulations yet, is all we did was we dug down 4 inches deeper than it called for on the plan. So we just put it on the bottom. I really wanted to put some on the top, but then I was skirting the possibility of having it not get approved. So I didn't do that.
Okay.
Now, how about water? Drinking water. Now, the water doesn't taste the same as it did 20 years ago, 30, how long ago. Tasting water is totally, I can't drink out of a hose anymore. I'm afraid who does.
One word, amoeba.
Now,
Definitely wouldn't do it.
Using biochar, would it clear the water system up or some kind of way?
There's a lot of focus on using biochar in water filtration. Again, you have to know what it is you're either harvesting, if it's nutrients, or you're trying to filter out, which is toxins of all sorts. And it has been shown to, absorb all sorts of heavy metals, antibiotics, medication, but not all biochars can do all of that. So from what I've heard from people that are trying to sell into the wastewater treatment industry, they're displacing activated carbon. But activated carbon generally has a much higher surface area, which isn't the only determining factor, but it's a tough sell because these people want really consistent, high-performing material before they'll switch. There's a lot of liability in this, but there's also a lot of focus in the developing world on using biochar because it is much more cost effective than activated carbon.
Well, besides the glyphosates and stuff that we were talking about, like in the city and stuff, like they're talking about medications and stuff being in the drinking water and how it's not even getting filtered through.
Yeah. So
people are ingesting like, oxycodone and like all of that stuff, and they don't even know it. Or some antidepressant medications, they never get out of the water. And so, that's really scary.
It is. Yeah. So yes, it can help, but not all biochars can filter all things.
Yeah.
I think I said, I don't know if this was before the show, but I used to do just a quick and dirty example at my daughter's school of putting food coloring in a glass and then putting biochar in, and it's gone by the next day. So, and then we also do these tests where you have sand, gravel, and biochar, and I would let the kids put their, different recipes in different orders, and we would see which ones worked better in terms of getting clear water. So there's a lot of fun things you can do on it. But if I were on an island with nothing, not much in the way of resources, I would definitely make some biochar and use it for filtering water.
Yeah.
If anybody has any questions in the chat, just put them, make sure they're all up in caps so we can answer them. So we talked about the beginning when biochar started. We talked about biochar pretty much where we are right now. What's the future? What's being worked on that nobody knows? What's going on?
Yeah, there's so much going on. It's mind-boggling these days. It's really hard to stay on top of this industry anymore because there's thousands of research articles published every year now. It's just impossible to keep up. But as I said, I'm interested in its use in soils. I use it myself. I participate in projects with farmers and whatnot, but I really see the big opportunity in displacing certain high embodied carbon materials with biochar. I really think we need to understand what we make today and how much of that comes from fossil fuels. And we need to get away from that and figure out how to use biochar. So things like putting it in rubber tires, it can go a long way. Putting it in concrete. I'm hoping to have my driveway put in with a pretty high amount of biochar, to make it carbon neutral. And we can do that. And it's not just biochar, it's co-products of pyrolysis, which could be wood vinegar. In certain industrial machines, you can get wood vinegar, which is great for gardening as well. Or you can get bio oil, which could be used in asphalt. So I think we need to think more holistically about not just the biochar, but how can we get the most out of that biomass beyond just the biochar and the carbon sequestration. So yeah, it's a new frontier. I wrote an article, a blog a couple of years ago under my Finger Lakes Biochar blog called The 5 Stages of Falling in Love with Biochar. And I was seeing so many new people come into biochar, and we all sort of go through this same phase of, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, I have so much hope. And then you want to evangelize and then you get overwhelmed. And then I said, really what we all need to do is kind of focus on a few things ourselves to make a difference. And that's the hardest part for me because I'm enamored by many different rabbit holes, but I think the industry needs to kind of still get people focused on what in water filtration is the biggest problem that biochar can solve, because the message gets diluted, I think, when it goes everywhere.
So just, Kathleen, just to clarify, so it would remove the fluoride that's added to water?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I've never seen research on that question. It might immobilize it. Again, I'm cautious of removing versus immobilizing because it's still there, but it's in the biochar. So
yeah. So then how would you, like you said, how would you dispose of the biochar then? Because now it's sucked up all of that stuff. So we got to find ways to like get rid of the biochar after it's done that. Like,
yeah. And if it's harvesting nutrients, that's one thing. If it's pulling out heavy metals, a lot of people are looking at putting it in concrete in that case, or asphalt, because it's still immobilized. It's not, gonna leach out. I don't think it would anyway. Fluoride, I don't know. I'd have to research that one. It's a good question.
So we really want to get into biochar. That's the reason why we asked you on. We actually even have membership level at $2.99 called the Biochar level. So
I like it.
And so that's what we really want to get into. Everything's about the soil. Everything starts with the soil. So anything we could do to improve the soil, that's what we always want to talk about. Now, for a potting soil, would you recommend a little bit in it? Doesn't really,
unless you're making your own potting soil and displacing vermiculite or perlite, then yes, maybe. But if you're buying it off the shelf, I don't see any real reason to.
So biochar, it could be like used as like a vermiculite or perlite. It could be that light and fluffy.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it holds water better than vermiculite. I had gone through this whole thing years ago. But the interesting thing in certain places like Ireland, I was there last fall, and they are banning peat moss for use in gardening. So they're trying to see, at what level biochar could displace peat moss in things like mushroom farming.
Interesting.
I don't think they have a definitive answer, but again, these are all high embodied carbon materials that we need to move away from. So the more you can displace that with biochar, I think the better,
They're going to create some kind of super mushroom. Like, you know how like we have lion's mane and all those ones that are like super good for you. So it's going to increase the immunity of the mushroom, and we're just going to get like super pills or something.
Yeah. Whether it's better than cocoa coir, again, depends on what you're trying to do with the cocoa coir. I can tell you that it lasts longer. And it probably holds more water. But there are different things you're trying to achieve with coir and peat moss and vermiculite and perlite. So yeah, it depends. The downside of the biochar in some of these potting soils is that you may have to water a bit more often, because it does suck up a lot of water. It will be plant available, but at least initially, it's just going to take more water.
Oh, so basically, if you're starting out, be careful using the biochar because, especially with little teeny starts, because you're going to be sucking all that water out of there.
Yep.
And like, those felt bags that you can always buy them in bulk. Like, I wouldn't use it in that because because those already suck up all the water anyway. Yeah. Unless you have something underneath that holds the water. Yeah. Like, I wouldn't use biochar in those either because one year I had like 30 of them and I planted a bunch of stuff in them. I literally had to water them almost twice a day.
Yeah.
Because those bags just sucked up everything and like it made my soil so dry.
Yeah. One of the things I always advised for the coffee growers is putting biochar in the nursery tree potting mix is a good idea because it does help get them into production. It helps with survival rates and stuff like that. And putting them in new tree transplants, I think, is a better use than putting them around existing trees. But yeah, I mean, if you are using these already water absorbing things, then you have to understand that biochar is probably going to increase your watering amount in the short term, at least.
Yeah. Interesting.
I'm starting to wonder if you put it in different layers in a potting mix. So if your bottom was biochar with compost and your top was a different kind of potting soil, would the roots go to reach the biochar
for the water?
With the water at a faster rate.
Mm-hmm. Might make a bigger carrot, maybe.
I did my lasagna composting last year, which is great. It was probably only a foot thick, but I'm just about to order some new raised beds, and that's exactly what I'm like asking my biochar friends. I'm like, all right, if I have 2 feet, I want to put biochar in there, but should it be layered? I am not sure, because that's a good soil, it's already not compacted. It's not going to get compacted. What's the point? But I have 2 super sacks of biochar, so I want to use it. I just want to use it in the most efficient way.
People are laughing at me because I do a carrot competition on my channel like once a year. FYI, guys, use some biochar. Your roots are going to reach to it because it's going to want water.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
That got me really thinking about. That's the reason why I asked that question all about the roots.
Joe's going to win my competition.
What's the biggest you've gotten so far?
I think it was 34 inches.
Wow.
Yeah. We didn't even win our own competition. We have people from the UK in it. And theirs was like, I don't know, 90 inches long or something. Because they do that. They do that for, that's some of their professions. They do these competitions. So yeah, ours was the small one. But it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
I can't wait to see all these other companies within the next 10 years start producing stuff with biochar. Because you see all these gimmicks out there.
Yeah.
With even hot sauce with Pepper X that just came out. All these little things. I wonder what they could produce in the ag world of, everything. It's kind of, to me, it gets a little interesting what they come up with. Here you go at Lowe's, instead of one aisle, we got two aisles.
Every time I go through Lowe's, I'm like, we could make that out of biochar, that out of biochar. And then, in the building world, since I built my house and I've talked to big construction companies, they're like, well, how soon is this going to be available? And I'm like, well, if somebody like you would get behind it with a purchase order, I'm sure it would go a lot faster. But yeah, there's a lot of interest. I advise startups that are coming into the biochar world on different things. And there are two that are really fascinating to me. One is making a structured insulation panel with a foam of biochar. And then another one in the UK has a spray foam insulation with biochar, which I just find that fascinating. And those are really high embodied carbon materials made from fossil fuels that if we can get biochar in the built environment, that's amazing. And last week I was talking to a guy that is a high-end timber frame builder, and he's putting biochar between the floor joists as a humidity control thing, just loose biochar. And it's amazing. And he's going to start making his own biochar from the cutoffs from his carpentry stuff. And that's such a great closed loop scenario. We need a lot more of that.
Now, biochar doesn't create like bigger vegetables or anything. It just makes the nutrients go into the roots more. Correct?
Oh, those people that are in the biochar world for the last 10 or 12 years and are doing it in their own gardens, they can show you some amazing pictures. This guy, Bob Wells, look him up. He's one of them. He's had these, I don't know if it was turnips or something, that were incredible. And one of the other legends in the biochar world, Stephen Joseph in Australia, he's also had amazing success. Now they understand the biology a lot more than I do.
They're probably mixing it with a manure as well.
Or other mineral complexes.
Yeah.
So it's a lot more sophisticated than I am on that front. But they're achieving some great things. One of the best stories is out in Western Australia that has super dry soils. The guy was feeding his cattle biochar and totally changed the soil consistency. But he also was putting it in new avocado groves. And he had amazing success compared to anyone else in the region. And now all of the avocado farmers there won't plant new trees without biochar. So, that again is where you get the right farmers that are willing to try something new and are willing to tell their story. And it's a good story.
Now, this is going to be really weird. And I'm saying this because of the Biochar projects who's in the chat. He has a compost toilet. Could you put this in your compost toilet?
Of course.
And it would block smells and, stuff like that.
That would really help Billy.
Yeah. Really I'm just saying,
my co-author does that. I did it when I was building this house. I had a bucket of just biochar in my basement for everyone to utilize. And whenever I have groups of people here, that I don't want coming into my house, I have one of those, and then I just throw it in my compost pile, and it's great. Yeah.
Nice. There you go, Billy. You don't have to worry about anything like that anymore. Just use biochar.
You just saved your marriage.
So this question about floor joists and humidity control, I had the same question because I was going to put it under my floor. I built a passive house, and they called for insulation under your floor. And I was like, well, can't I just use biochar? And I was hesitant, so I didn't do it. But this guy who's, he's a builder, he did it in somebody else's house, and everybody was more worried about it being a fire hazard. But frankly, the amount of humidity within the house and the build is marginal. I think it would be much more outside of the house than it is inside. So he and this is an old Korean or Japanese technique that they put charcoal in their floors and stuff. So that's been around for a long time. The other interesting thing that he and I have been discussing is when you have subsidence around a new house, whether you should put the biochar there, which I did last year. I'm not sure if I should have or not, but I'm testing it out because it's not going to subside in the same way that clay soils, which is what I have, will. I mean, it will subside to some extent, but it won't pack down as much. So I want to not only have a non-packing, but also a way that it'll absorb some of the moisture.
That is so funny that you mentioned it's a Japanese technique, and we used it on my beds because my beds are not treated, my wood beds. So we charred them, and then we used linseed oil
to
protect it, and they've lasted us. I think we have had them down for 5 or 6 years, and they're not decaying in any way. So that's
Shoshiguban.
Huh?
That's the Shoshiguban. That's
yes,
the technique.
I couldn't pronounce it, but yes.
I did that on my house as well.
Me and Joe are horrible at pronouncing things.
Yeah, it's a great way to you know prevent normal weathering.
Yeah, it worked really well, and we were real surprised. And my husband read about it. He's like, "Hey, this is like gonna be like 100% organic then, you know." And
Exactly.
yeah, it's worked out really good for the past few years. So
cool.
Now, how about like with wood, with building a house and layering it with some kind of biochar? Would that have any benefits?
Say more. I'm not sure I understand the question.
I don't either. I'm just answering somebody wrote down before.
Yeah.
Like you're talking about like figuring out ways to use biochar within the house, within your property, within anything. So like the pavement and incorporating somehow in that. Outside your lawn with moisture control where it flows to.
Yep.
Oh.
Well, I would also say that like a lot of times when things are burned or charred like that, they don't burn.
Yeah, it is more fire resistant.
Yeah. And a lot of people, like if they've had a house fire and they've had beams that have burned or charred, they leave them in because that is going to be the strongest point in your house.
Oh,
it makes it like, I don't know, like what do they call that process where wood, it's petrified, I guess you would say. So it makes it harder. I don't know. I'm not an expert or anything, but
I do know that putting it in concrete and things like that reduces spalling and increases fire resistance and things like that. But yeah, I don't know about petrifying it. The Shoshiguban is supposed to help with sealing it. So again, it's like not viewed as food for insects and stuff like that because they don't like the smell of charred wood and stuff like that. So I'll take you over to my office and show you my biochar wall.
Oh, this is so cool.
It's probably a mess in here. I haven't been in here all day, so I don't know if you can see the black wall there.
Oh, yeah. So cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
This is one of my shrines to biochar. This is concrete with a little biochar in it. And so this is the agricultural mulch that I was telling you about that they're using in developing in RIT. And this is a sort of insulation that I made with rice husk biochar. It has the same insulating value as expanded polystyrene. This is one of the recipes we use to make biochar into, I'm reversing myself here, into drywall. So we had expanded glass balls in there and gypsum and biochar.
This is so fascinating.
Your house is beautiful.
Oh, thank you. And then I have all things biochar here. These are some of my samples. My most recent sample of biochar is from camel manure. Oh, it's hard to see.
That's crazy.
Yes. Well, it's messy there. So anyway, yes, I was in Dubai for COP28.
Oh, wow.
And I just happened to meet these guys who had just turned on a machine to carbonize camel manure. And everybody's like, why would you want to do that? help it, use it for fertilizer. But interestingly, they get no rain, and so it doesn't do anything. It just sits there. They landfill it, and nothing is growing where they landfill all this camel manure. They have 8,500 camels that they milk for dairy, for camel milk. So it was fascinating, but I said, I need a sample. So
That's awesome. I tell people that camel is my spirit animal because I love camels and I think they're so cute. And I did some research on the milk. Camel milk is like so good for you.
It is.
Good for your stomach.
Yes.
Yeah.
I bought some dried camel milk for $50. But interestingly, I learned a lot that, they don't give nearly as much milk, but they also don't go into, they don't make them get pregnant as often as dairy cattle.
Yeah.
So the quantity is very different. So that's one of the reasons.
I've never tasted it. I heard it's really sweet. Is it really sweet?
Yeah, I had it in ice cream. I had camel meat over there too. It's depends on how you make it. I had one bad, one great. So
interesting.
Yeah. So this is pretty interesting. You got Amby.
I know Amby. Yeah.
I see him in LinkedIn all the time. He's always posting almost every single day.
Yes. Yeah, he's very active over in Cameroon, and Africa is going like gangbusters, mostly on the small scale farmer side of things. But I think he was involved in one of the first industrial scale biochar units in Cameroon. And Cameroon was the first country to actually include biochar in their nationally determined contributions, which is amazing.
I have a lot of friends online and a lot of friends I talk to from South Africa. So that's really cool.
Yeah, South Africa has a history of charcoal making. And I was speaking to a guy this week who is trying to set up larger scale production in South Africa, but they're in the same situation of how to get farmers to adapt it. But they have huge issues with invasive species that they're trying to turn into biochar and figure out what to do with it.
There you go, Florida. Now you know what to do with all your invasive reptiles.
I don't know about that. And there's certain invasive species you don't want to turn into biochar, like poison ivy. I think the toxins get airborne. So
yeah, that's scary.
Okay. Yeah. But I had carbonized a lot of honeysuckle, which was invading my previous home, and makes great biochar. It's a good thing to do. It totally gets rid of the problem. So
the thing that fascinates me the most about biochar is that you can make it out of anything. I mean, you can use it as long as it's not toxic and you're not making it out of like rubber or something.
Yeah.
But like, I like the fact that you can make it out of anything. Like I could have used my sunflower stalks last year because they were real hard. They would have turned into beautiful biochar. Just something I thought I had to use hardwoods to do it. Yeah. So I'm so glad that I can use it out of anything. So
my curiosity is whether you can put biochar around things that have juglone, like walnut trees, and mitigate that problem. So you could introduce more than just those that plants that tolerate juglone, or even just making biochar out of walnut, the shells, the green things, or just branches, which normally is not something you want to promote. Putting it around, even the leaves, they still have a little bit of that juglone. But I think if you make it into biochar, you get rid of that. I don't have any proof of that. It's just my theory.
Now, squash bugs. Squash bugs.
You're like demons.
Question.
They're like demons. They're horrible.
An overwintering pest. And when you have biochar in the ground, any results with that we should know? Does it differ? They still pest? They still...
I think biochar probably plays a minor role, if any, in that. What I will say is that a lot of places where you have too much leaf litter or fungal issues in your leaf litter and you want to get rid of it, the best thing to do is turn that into biochar. But as far as, I think you're better off praying for cold weather than putting biochar in the ground.
Yeah, like I didn't even think about this too. Biochar, you're burning it. So you're getting rid of bacteria and viruses and whatever by burning it. And that's something I didn't even think about. Like it goes to a level that makes my brain hurt a little bit. But
well, and I wrote the last blog I wrote because I'm reading this book called Eating to Extinction, and it's talking about all these blights that we have. And once it's in the soil, you know, not only is that crop of the year ruined, you got to do something with it. Well, turn that into biochar, because you're not going to deal with what's in the soil, but you'll deal with what's in the leftover crops that are generally unusable.
It's really cool.
So is there any other questions in the chat? So Kathleen, we're gonna, I hope you can come on sometime again, because we got to digest everything.
That's how it is with biochar. I get it.
Dee's Garden, I have no idea how you would get rid of the vine borer. All I can say is use the biochar to help make your squashes, your zucchini and stuff like that, the immune system built up. But I don't know if that will stop the vine borer. I mean, yeah, that thing is a demon too. Little sucker. It likes to get into everything. I don't even know how you would possibly use biochar to get rid of that, but you could sure try.
It is not a one-size-fits-all solution. I don't want to oversell it. That's why I say I'm a bit of a myth slayer, because in the biochar world, people claim it can do all sorts of miraculous things, and sometimes it can, and sometimes it can't.
Well, the healthier the plant, usually the insects, they don't go to that. They want to go to the more diseased plants. So with biochar, it makes a healthier plant, you know, so it should have less disease pressure.
Survival of the fittest. And we're just trying to help it get more fit.
And here's Kathleen's book. Thank you, Jane, for posting this during the whole live. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and like Joe said, it all goes back to the soil. So the healthier the soil, the better your plants are. And the more they don't set off that pheromone, like, help me, I'm dying kind of thing. So bugs won't come in and eat them. They don't want them because they're healthy. They want to just eat your plants that are doing okay. So, yeah, that's something to think about when using biochar, guys. Make your plants healthier.
And don't feed the plant, feed the soil. So change your way of thinking. Your philosophy for 50 years was feed the plant, feed the plant. No, feed the soil, feed the soil.
So true. Yeah.
Kathleen, you are so fun. I love having you on, and you're so full of information. And I love the way you talk to people. Like, you say it on a level that everyone can understand. And that's the most important thing, especially with biochar, so people can understand how to use it. What is it used for? And so thank you for doing that for people, because that's what people need.
Well, I say I have to dumb it down, all the science, so that I can understand it, because I'm not a scientist, but I'm fascinated by it. So it has sort of made me into a bit of a science wannabe. But that takes a lot of reading and digesting and asking questions. So.
And thank you, everybody, from the LinkedIn page. There's 12 people actually watching right now on the LinkedIn page. We thank you guys so much for watching.
Thank you, guys. I've tried, everyone that's commented on LinkedIn, I tried to say hello back. So thank you guys for coming in and watching. And I hope you enjoyed this as much as we have.
And our channel is concentrating on the soil. So within compost, biochar, and things like that, that's what we want to concentrate on.
This has raised my gardening level like so much. Like, there's just so much stuff now that I want to do, like cover crops, and like it has raised my brain to this level of like, I can't wait to do this. It's going to make my garden better. Can't wait.
So at 3 o'clock in the morning, Quirky's going to be outside because she can't sleep. She's going to be thinking about it.
Talking to my cucumbers. Just a little bit more.
Awesome. So thank you again, Kathleen. This is awesome. And thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
All right.
And we'll hope
Good
to
luck.
talk to you soon.
Keep me posted.
You have a
Thank you,
wonderful
thank you.
night. You too.
Have a great. Thank you.
That was so freaking
Wow,
awesome.
that was so cool.
I love that. I hope you guys out there loved it just as much as we did. She's so cool. Like I knew from the moment that I talked to her, like this is going to be a great interview because she's so down to earth. I love it. So,
When they're talking about the soil and the researchers only went so far, and then you're talking about mushrooms and 3% of mushrooms have been identified. Well, biochar, I think it's going to be the same way and how we grow our own food with the most nutrient dense foods.
right.
And so I think this is a thing that we should concentrate on. Concentrate on compost, concentrate on your biochar. It's all about nutrition. It's about our future.
One thing I freaking forgot to ask is about hydroponics. I wonder if you could put like a little bit of that in your hydroponic water. I didn't even think about it, but it might do wonders and might add more nutritional, because a lot of things I have a problem with hydroponics is that you don't get the nutritional value that you should, like you planted in the soil. So if you just maybe, I don't know, add a little biochar to your water or something, I wonder if it would, give your plants a little more nutritional value.
So many things we got to look at.
Yeah.
It really is.
Like I didn't even think about that to ask, but yeah.
And I love our house too.
I know. So cool.
That was beautiful. It was like, wow, you have the Wickershire project with where he's at, and you go in there, you feel like you're watching something from in a cave or something. It's like it's an interesting shire. And Kathleen's house was great. It's nice to see things. It's like show and tell.
Right.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you guys for coming on. There's great stuff ahead with our channel. We're starting getting stuff booked already in April. So look for a lot of good stuff happening on our channel. If you guys want to become a member, there's benefits to becoming members. All starts with the biochar level to the master gardeners level. And everything's always appreciated here. So everyone have a great night. Thank you guys.
Have a wonderful night, and I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. And we will see you next time, guys. Have a good one.
Have a good one. Mwah.